Rosenstrasse Protest is one of the largest, if not the largest, public demonstration against the deportation of Jews in the Third Reich. It is remarkable as it is. The exhibit seen here today and the events that we've organized for the next few days, they will highlight the courageous women at the center of the protest who fought for their husbands. Give us our husbands back. The event tonight is perfectly timed because today is a special day. I believe most of you who been to Berlin or to Eastern Europe may know what this special day is. Any guesses?
Frauentag.
Frauentag. Today is International Women's Day. A day that is celebrated and marked, especially in Eastern Europe, but which has been a public holiday in Berlin for a few years. And it is a day that marks the achievements of women, but the challenges that women face in this day and age. So well timed, everyone. Thank you very much. The Rosenstrasse Protest is maybe not as well anchored in the public or collective or individual memories of many Germans. Not many Germans will know what this is all about. It's not as well anchored as, for instance, the movement of the White Rose or the assassination attempt against Hitler. It is completely different in nature, and that's what makes it fascinating. And we will hear more about this fascinating protest and those events by our eminent speakers. I stop here. And now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our very own ambassador, Emily Harvard. Not that she needs introduction, because I'm sure she's very well known in the scenes of Washington, D.C. in the US. But let me mention that she's been ambassador to the US since June 2018. Prior to her transfer to Washington, D.C., she served in various leadership functions at the Foreign Office in Berlin and at the Ministry of Interior in Berlin. She was appointed political director at the Foreign Office in 2019, State Secretary to hold that post. Is this correct, Ambassador? First woman to hold that post at the Foreign Office in 2011. The list goes on, but I don't want to steal anybody's time. She also, but I think I should mention that for further conversation, she also has many years of experience in Russia and in Moscow. On a very personal note, she also holds a PhD in history. So she's very qualified at all levels to be our first speaker tonight. Thank you very much for being here, Ambassador.
Dear Klaus Grischok, Dr. Susan Nyman, Dr. Edna Friedberg, Ruth Wiseman, Dr. Nathan Stoltzfus, Dr. Michael Brenner, Dr. Mordecai Paldil, and honored guests. First of all, thank you all for making this important gathering possible. The exhibition we open tonight with a very distinguished panel featuring leading experts and those with intimate ties to the subject matter sheds light on what is, I think, one of the most extraordinary events of the Nazi years, well, the Frauen Protests, meaning the demonstrations of women, wives, mothers, protesting the arrest and the imminent deportation of their Jewish husbands and children. There are lasting lessons to it. One of the lasting lessons was that resistance and persistence in it was actually possible. Something often impugned by those who strive to justify or explain the lack of it. The second lasting lesson was protest could and did make a difference. As you said, Mr. Bishop, the Rosenstrasse Protest in Nazi Germany were little known. There's a beautiful and touching memorial in the Rosenstrasse, in the heart of Berlin. But I would contend that still today, many people, Berliners included, have not heard of the protests, let alone appreciated their significance. And it's only fitting that we are honoring the women of the Rosenstrasse tonight, 80 years after the protest, on International Women's Day. They were courageous women. Look, when the women took the streets, they did not know how perilous their protests would be. It was anything but a foregone conclusion that they would, or even could, save their husbands, or sons or daughters from deportation, that they could save their lives. There was no playbook for the protest. There was no precedent. There was no plausible expectation of outcomes. There they were, in the heart of the city of Berlin, between the 27th of February and the 6th of March, calling for the release of their loved ones. How could they not have known, how would they not have known, that this also meant opposing the Nazi dictatorship and its murderous intentions? The risks that every single demonstrating woman took on was extremely high, and that is almost certainly what all of them felt. These were the weeks when the Nazi rule was somewhat under pressure. The Sixth Army at Stalingrad had collapsed in early February. It ended to exist. For the war in the East, and I think for public awareness, this was a watershed moment. Shortly after, on 18th of February, in the Berlin Sports Palace, Goebbels demanded total allegiance from Germans in a total war, an event of terrifying extremism. In the Berlin factory raids end of February, thousands of Jews were rounded up for deportation to concentration and extermination camps. Thus, to the contemporary observer and to all the women protesting, the odds must have seemed minimal and the danger enormous. This was the context. It was what all the women must have been aware of. But what happened was the protests continued. The crowds even seemed to grow. There are different reports as to the numbers. I asked the most eminent expert, Dr. Stoltzfus, about whether there were several hundred or well over thousands. But however large the numbers were, in any event, they must have been substantial, because the Nazi regime was supposed to reconsider. Goebbels notes it in his diary when he said that he would have to give orders to the SD to discontinue the operation, or at least that part of the operation. And it is blatantly obvious the regime felt it was more risky to proceed with the deportation of Jewish husbands and children of the protesting wives than to desist, at least for the moment. The incredibly courageous protests of women saved Jewish lives. It was, as far as I know, the only public demonstration against the persecution of Jews in Germany. It did not alter the Nazi zeal for the ultimate destruction of European Jewry, but it gave a reprieve to several thousand Jews married to non-Jewish wives and their offspring. And the reprieve outlasted the war. They survived. The many thousand Jews who were rounded up in the factory raids and on Berlin streets at the same time did not. They were deported to Theresienstadt, to Auschwitz, to other death camps. Most of them perished. Again, the lesson was clear. Resistance was possible, and it could and did make a difference. I'm pleased that today, here in Washington, but also in Berlin, we're doing justice to the heroes of the Rosenstrasse. As you mentioned, it took a long time. For decades after the protest at Rosenstrasse, people did not recall it, not even historians. The publication of Dr. Stoltzfus' book, Resistance of the Heart, which is considered the seminal work on the Rosenstrasse Protest, coincided in the mid-1990s with the placement of the memorial to the Rosenstrasse Protest in Berlin at the site itself. This time it was probably less due to chance and more to a generational and political shift that accompanied the gradual emergence of a culture of memory, which brought such important stories to the fore. And we're deeply grateful to Dr. Stoltzfus, Dr. Pallier, the Rosenstrasse Foundation, the USHMA, and all those who engage in civic society to preserve and disseminate the memory of the Rosenstrasse Protest. And what I hope tonight is that this event and the exhibition here at the Goethe-Institut on a very inspirational and important moment contributes to our understanding of how, even under extreme conditions of terror regimes, courage, resistance, and persistence in this can make a difference. And I turn over the floor to Dr. Susan Neumann.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Haber. Now it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Susan Neumann. She is, of course, a board member of the Rosenstrasse Foundation. Correct. Professor Neumann is also the director of the Einstein Floor. And I hope you all know where that is. It's in Potsdam, just outside Berlin. Susan Neumann was born in Atlanta, Georgia. She studied philosophy at Harvard and at the Free University in Berlin. She was a professor at Yale University and at Tel Aviv University. We'll talk about Tel Aviv in a moment after that, before coming to Potsdam to the Einstein Floor. She's written extensively on enlightenment, moral philosophy, metaphysics, and politics, and her work shows that philosophy is a living force for contemporary thinking and action. Welcome, Susan Neumann.
Thank you for your kind introduction. I'm also a member of the board of the Goethe-Institut. So it's particularly nice to be here. It's hard to find a mid-sized town in Germany that doesn't have a street named after Sophie and Hans Scholl, Zichronam Levracha. It's a Hebrew benediction that you say for people you want to remember. Or the very least, a Geschwister Scholl, Schule. Until historians and the media began to point out how odd it was that Stauffenberg and other Prussian aristocrats waited till July 44 after Normandy, not to mention Stalingrad, to attempt an assassination, and also pointed out their views were not exactly those of Ruth Demokraten. The conspirators were often held up as heroes of the Bundesrepublik, though many considered them traitors all the way into the 80s. Now, every year on July 20th, the Bundeswehr celebrates the failed assassination of 1944. I'd be surprised if you could study high school history in Germany today without hearing the names Scholl and Stauffenberg. So why is it that I get blank stares when I point people away from the Holocaust Memorial at Brandenburger Tor and towards one of my two favorite monuments in Berlin, Rosenstrasse? They say, what's that? The Rosenstrasse Memorial, for those who've never seen it, is right in the middle of town, next to the busiest set of intersections in Berlin, Alexanderplatz. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if a tourist missed it, since you have to turn down a side street. But as both of the speakers before me pointed out, I have mentioned the monument to hundreds of Berliners who have walked by the Rosenstrasse many times and never heard the story. So this is the place to add my thanks to Nathan Stoltzfus for doing the research that kept that story alive. I met Nathan 39 years ago when Alexanderplatz was behind the wall and we were both clueless Fulbright fellows in West Berlin. Nathan was less clueless than I was, I suspect, and his research project was already clearer than mine. He was busy finding eyewitnesses who were still alive to what happened in the dead of winter 1943. I suspect it's not accidental that the research was undertaken by a non-German historian, that is a historian of Germany who is not himself German. There are at least two reasons why Germans prefer not to remember the Rosenstrasse. It's much easier to remember the Scholls and the Stauffenbergs, who accomplished absolutely nothing and were executed almost immediately after trying. The message thus conveyed provides comfort to millions of Mitläufer and their descendants, namely, resisting the Nazis was pointless and merely distributing a pamphlet against them could be fatal. How could you expect anyone to try? The Rosenstrasse lets no one off the hook. It shows that it was, in fact, possible to resist the Nazis in the center of Berlin and live to tell the tale. Now, you can dismiss the actions of these courageous women by suggesting that they acted not from the head, but the heart. I understand the title of the book, Nathan, and it's a lovely title, but I want to problematize that a little bit. After all, it was their family members' lives that were at stake. There were many, many Germans who abandoned their non-Aryan partners and even their children. So it wasn't, or wasn't only, emotion or blood that determined who stood up when standing up was needed. It was principle. We all know what actions principles of justice demand, even if, as Immanuel Kant showed in the Critique of Practical Reason, none of us know what we'd actually do when faced with an unjust tyrant who has the power to let us live or die. Most of us would probably falter. But most of us know what we should do, and we know that we could do it, even in the face of death. It's this fact, the fact of reason, Kant called it, which proves that human beings are free, even if we choose to ignore that freedom and take easier paths. So Kant concluded that the best way to teach morality to everyone, as he put it a bit anachronistically, even businessmen, women, and 10-year-old boys. He didn't get everything right. The best form of moral education focuses on examples of heroes, real men and women who actually lived and sometimes died by the principles we all profess. This is not a popular view in Germany today, where few, if any, know it was held by Kant. Of course, Kant himself is extraordinarily unpopular these days, but that's another story. For post-war Germans, the very word hero has been tarnished. And the claim that we live in a post-heroic age is repeated like a mantra. But the idea of heroism is prevalent not just in Germany, but in most places these days, especially among progressives who rightly have contributed to deconstructing old heroes who turned out to be rather vile. I think Christopher Columbus, who was so zealous in torturing indigenous peoples who failed to deliver as much gold as he wanted, that King Ferdinand at one point relieved him of his command. So to counter old-fashioned theories of history, which overlooked grave crimes of many of the supposed great men who allegedly made history, most progressives today prefer to do without heroes at all. Scratch a hero, they say, and you'll find a legend. Look closer and you'll be lucky if all you find are feet of clay. Real heroes, not martyrs, those who accomplish something, are only made in Hollywood. The very idea is kitsch. By the way, that's not my view. I'm talking about other people's view, just to make it entirely clear. I suspect that's the reason that Nathan's work has stirred up controversy in Germany, where some have questioned his account of the efficacy of the protests. Good Germans that they are, they're committed to facing the darkness. They don't quite know what to do with points of light. But Nathan comes from another direction, as I discovered this morning when I read his Wikipedia entry. I don't usually read people's Wikipedia entries because I know how often they're distorted. In my memory, we had met long ago because we were both Fulbright fellows. He says my memory is correct, although it was a year later than I thought. But he was also supported by a fellowship founded by a man whose name I didn't know at the time, Gene Sharp. named after someone whose name I did know but didn't much like, Albert Einstein. I didn't like Einstein at the time because I accepted the standard view of Einstein as the unworldly genius who could barely tie his shoelaces. The real Einstein was a savvy socialist civil rights activist who used his fame to help out the young Gene Sharp during the McCarthy years, as Einstein supported Paul Robeson, W.B. Du Bois, and so many others. And Einstein and Sharp knew that if you want to move people towards effective, nonviolent civil disobedience, you have to inspire them with examples of real existing heroes. My friend and comrade, Eva Menassa, who spoke 2 days ago at the parallel Rosenstrasse ceremony in Berlin, recently said that the most abused words in the German language are Mut und Zivilcourage. Abused because so many people call for them and so few actually show them. I'm appalled when I hear it's supposedly courageous to speak a word that's considered taboo or invite a speaker who's been canceled. Real courage, I reply, is what men and women in Iran are doing today when they risk their lives to oppose their government. Like the women of the Rosenstrasse, their example should strengthen our spines for easier tasks. But as I know was done at the Parallel Memorial 2 nights ago in Berlin, people are drawing contemporary examples. And I also want to mention 2 Israeli friends of mine who have inspired me this week through the stories and videos they sent from Havara, the Palestinian village that suffered a pogrom last week, which reminded one of those friends of his grandmother's stories from Ukraine. When the current Israeli Minister of Finance, who proudly calls himself a fascist homophobe, responded to criticisms of the pogrom by saying the village should be wiped out, some 500 Israelis responded by going to stand side by side with the Palestinians whose homes and lives were threatened. Among them were 2 friends of mine, David Shulman, he of the Ukrainian grandmother, who's also a world-famous scholar, MacArthur Fellow, and nonviolent activist, and Avram Burg, who was once Speaker of the Knesset and President of the Jewish Agency, and now says it's not he, but the State of Israel, which has changed. Avram's tweet read, Havara is the forefront of Israeli morality. Going there is the only way a decent and moral human should be, with the victims, end quote. Both are older men who were roughed up and thrown to the ground by Israeli border guards in full military gear. In the last few days, I have replayed that video and read their messages over and over, for they give me strength and courage. We cannot fight anti-Semitism by throwing Jewish values and commitment to human rights into the flames. The women of the Rosenstrasse were not Jewish, and they stood by and saved their men, not only out of love, but out of conviction that tribal differences are never what matter most. If we cannot learn that from the Rosenstrasse, we are probably doomed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan Nyman, for your very frank, poignant, and informative, inspiring words that bring what we're doing here today, not just into a historical context, but also into a relationship with what we're all experiencing in Iran, in Ukraine, in Israel, and across the world right now. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And the microphone needs to be in line. Okay, we'll lower it in a second because I'm just here to introduce our 3rd keynote speaker, Dr. Edna Friedberg. Edna Friedberg is Senior Curator at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and she's the host of the museum's popular Stay Connected programs on Facebook and on YouTube. Edna Friedberg joined the museum staff in 1999. Am I allowed to say this? Yes, I did say it already. So and she was the historian for the online Holocaust Encyclopedia. Highly recommendable. Now available in 20 languages. Congratulations, Edna. That's amazing. She also curated a special exhibit about the Nuremberg trials and post-war justice. And may I say, I believe ever since the Goethe-Institut in Washington, D.C. has existed, there have been various programs and encounters with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And since I'm new here, I promise this will not change, but we'll continue on that line. Please welcome Edna Friedberg.
So good evening. On behalf of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. We offer special thanks to Ambassador Haber, to Dr. Nyman, special thanks to you, Klaus Christoph, and the entire staff of the Goethe-Institut who worked so hard to host tonight's event. I will not speak long because I know you are all eager to hear from our panelists, from Dr. Brenner, from Nathan Stoltzfus, from Ruth Wiseman, and from Mordechai Paldia. But a few words. This evening, as has been mentioned, we are here to honor civil courage. And as much as we may be tired of hearing about it, I think we cannot talk about it enough. As you have heard and will soon learn about in more detail, 80 years ago, a courageous group of people, mostly women, had the audacity to publicly protest the arrest of their loved ones. And they did so a full decade into the rule of a regime that most typically cracked down on dissent. And yet, day after day, for over a week, these women returned to the Rosenstrasse to demand the release of their husbands, their children, all detained. Why? For the crime of being designated as Jewish in the Nazi classification of human beings. This is, as we've heard, a story about love, yes, but it is also, I would say, about knowledge. I hope that it prompts us to ask, what did and could ordinary Germans know at that moment in time? Berlin in late February and early March 1943 was a place of extreme anxiety. And as Ambassador Haber said, the military defeat at Stalingrad raised for the first time truly significant doubts about Germany's chances of winning the war. So this is a very tenuous moment. Additionally, thousands of German Jews who had been living this very precarious existence were being rounded up and deported. I do want us to keep in mind, though, time and place, and to remember that the protesters could not know at that moment all of the details that are clearer to us with the benefit of hindsight. So this makes what they did both braver and less brave, depending on how you examine it. What did they know? What could they know? What did they believe? What did they think could happen? But their fears for their families were based on something indisputable, having witnessed all too many friends and neighbors and in-laws who were taken away, never to return. And although they did gradually secure the release of most of the men and boys being held, it was a tragically brief respite, because police returned in the coming days to pick up most of the released men and the teenage boys and deport them to forced labor camps. It often surprises people, I know it surprised me as a graduate student, to learn that as late as 1943, any Jews remained alive within the borders of pre-war Germany, what had been Germany. That many months after millions of Jews had been murdered in occupied Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and other blood-soaked lands to the east, there were still Jews living in Germany at all. The Rosenstrasse protests also defies conventional understanding of the Holocaust, that some, perhaps as few as 200 women, could challenge the Nazi German regime and achieve anything at all. In a strange way, it can actually feel more comfortable to think about the Holocaust as a natural disaster for which there was no remedy or resistance once it was set in motion. And we see this also in other protests that I'll mention in a minute, the T4 program, the systematic murder of people with mental and physical disabilities. Studying this history in its specificity reveals case after case where individuals could and they did make a profound difference. For example, family members who acted on their suspicions and protested the systematic and secretive murder of tens of thousands of people with disabilities, many of them also young children. That operation was stopped for a time. It did resume. I'd also like to mention some men who served in the Einsatzgruppen, in mobile killing squads, who stepped out and refused orders to gun down civilians. And they were not killed for it. Many of them suffered even very little professional retribution. It showed that things were possible. These atypical people were not killed for their objections, and each of these and countless others pin a lie to the mouths of those who say they were just following orders and that nothing could be done by an average person or even someone in a position of power. So let me close by saying that, of course, these were the outliers, and there were far, far too few of them. If only more people across Europe, and not just in Germany, but in all sorts of locations in occupied countries, had been willing to take risks on behalf of their loved ones, but also of their acquaintances, of their coworkers, of their students, or even strangers. As we mark March 8th today as International Women's Day, we pay tribute to the bravery of the women who stood in the freezing cold on the Rosenstrasse, fighting with the weapons that they had, their courage and their voices. And they offer inspiration to us 80 years on. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Friedberg, for, in a way, building the perfect transfer to part 2 and setting our minds into where these women were mentally at the time and where their adversaries might have been at the time and what the context is. I think that really helps to understand the situation better. Let's not look at the event just from today, but let's for a moment try to put our imagination into what actually happened there in people's heads, in people's hearts 80 years ago. And we will hear more about this from our panelists right now. So this is officially the end of part 1. Open part 2. But the audience may have questions already. So please keep the questions for a little while, because we will have a question and answer session after the panel. And after the panel, we'll have a part 3, because Mordecai Poldiel will, all those who still have the courage and the patience and the energy to do so, will guide you through the exhibition and also answer individual questions. And I believe Susan, Edna, Ambassador Haber, will also answer questions. If there are, you'll stay. That is absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much. So this is my last appearance here for tonight. Maybe at the end I'll come back. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Michael Brenner, who in a way forms a perfect triangle between Washington, D.C., Munich, and Tel Aviv. He's also a very good friend of the Goethe-Institut, researches on so many things that I will not mention. And since you're the moderator, I cut your introduction a little bit shorter and leave you to introduce the other panelists. Once again, thank you very much, Ruth Wiseman, and of course, Dr. Nathan Stoltzfus, who's been mentioned, I believe, by every speaker, and who finally gets a chance to say something here tonight. Off you go.
Long time ago, heard about the story. I asked my mother if she knew about it. My mother was one of those last Jews in Germany who lived there until the Russians liberated her and her family. She lived there with the Yellow Star doing forced labor in ammunition factories. She was not in Berlin, she was in Dresden, and she of course did not know about it until long after the war. She was born Henny Wolf in 1924 in Dresden. Her mother was Jewish, from Russia originally. Her father was Protestant. And in her case, it was the other way around. It was her father who was her hero, because even though he was summoned a few times to the Gestapo in Dresden, he was told, you can keep your business. He had a movie theater. If you divorce your wife, he did not, and he stood by. And it was later during the war when he also helped the Jewish relatives of his wife, my grandmother, who were hidden in Berlin. And he went every week by train to bring them food, until one day he arrived there and they were all no longer there because they were denounced and all deported to Auschwitz. But he in a way helped, and of course he always said that was the most, I wasn't a hero. Of course I helped my family. Of course I would not divorce my wife, but as I think Susan said it, many did. And when they They did not, I mean, they went to work every day, my grandmother and my mother, with a yellow star to the factory, also fearing they would get their deportation order. They did not get their deportation order until pretty late, and it was just happened to be dated 2 days after the big bomb attack on Dresden, which saved their lives because they could go into hiding until the end of the war. So in a way, the Rosenstrasse story very much resonated with her once she learned about it long after the war, sometime after the war. And of course, it resonates with me as well. But we're really here to hear from you, and I am very honored and privileged to introduce our two speakers today in this panel. Ruth Wiseman is the daughter of Rosenstrasse survivor Rita Kuhn, whom you can see over there, who was arrested and interned as a child in Berlin. I think she was about the age of my mother, a little bit younger, I think. Wiseman fully embraces her Jewish heritage and is raising her family in the Orthodox Jewish faith. She studied international relations and Russian at the University of California, Davis. She has conducted interviews on behalf of the Holocaust Oral History Project and the survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. She's a board member of the Rosenstrasse Foundation and passionate about sharing the story of the Rosenstrasse Project, especially with younger generations. Nathan Stoltzfus is a historian, the Rentals Professor of Holocaust Studies at Florida State University, and co-founder, together with Mordechai Madiel, whom we will hear from later, of the Rosenstrasse Foundation. He's published 9 books, including Resistance of the Heart, as we've heard already, Intermarriage and the Rosenstrasse Protest. The German Schröder-Fischer government civil courage campaign provided key inspiration for launching the Rosenstrasse Foundation, about which we already heard. And I would say maybe we'll start with Ruth and then go to Nathan. And I think everybody talks about 10 minutes, we said, and then we'll have chance for questions and answers. It's not working.
I got it.
Hi, good evening, Navid. This is a very emotional day for me to be here with you all. So I hope I can present well. My mother lived with myself and my 2 daughters until June of this year. And so I am only very new in carrying her story forward, and it's emotionally very difficult, not only because I'm still grieving her, but because it's a difficult task to take over. And I find it incredibly appropriate that we are in the Goethe-Institut, because this was absolutely her favorite poet, and she would just be so thrilled. And so she's here with me in spirit. Once we get the slides up. So, yeah, I just want to give a little prequel in terms of people who divorced their Jewish spouses. I had a great aunt, and she married a count in the 1920s, and she did not grow up Jewish, but she was of Jewish heritage. This is my grandmother, but it just is a little prequel. And she married a count. And she had been on the cover of a magazine as being a German beauty, one of the most beautiful women in Germany at the time. I don't know what magazine this is. I want to find it. And they were at a party. This was, I think, before the Nazis came to power. For sure it was, because her son was only 2 years old. He was born in the late 20s. So somebody came up to the Count and said, "Ah, your wife, she's so beautiful. So astonishing that she's a Jew, is it not?" They went home that evening. He asked Ilse von Voda. He said, "Is it true that you're Jewish?" She said, "Well, you know, I was born Jewish." The next day he divorced her. And she was deported to Theresienstadt, and her son was a privileged Michelin, a privileged mixed marriage, and but he was nonetheless assigned to the Tod, which was a labor organization, a little less intense than the forced labor. So this is just, and my youngest daughter is named after her. She did come back from Theresienstadt in 1945, and unfortunately died of blood poisoning from a shot she received for her malnutrition. So this is an example of how easy it was for the non-Jewish spouses to divorce their spouses. This happened to be a very prominent person, but it was tremendous pressure from the party, especially for men, I believe, but women too. And I'm sure my grandmother, Frida, suffered her own duress. So I just, this is my mother's family on the left, my grandfather Fritz and Frida Kuhn, and my mother and her brother Hans, who still lives right outside of Berlin. And then my mother is on the right, and she's holding the Twitschule, and she is little Candy that they would take on their first day of school. So this was already around 1933. Probably she was about 5 or 6 years old. She was born in 1927. My grandmother, Frida, had converted to Judaism in the 1920s. Prior to marrying my grandfather, they courted for about 4 years, and his family was actually resistant to accepting her because she was of the working class, she was not Jewish. They had a match set up for him, this, Jewish girl who was from a more prominent family. His family was very prominent. The Kuhn family had been there since the 1700s or even earlier. At a certain point, the genealogical records start to get a little iffy. Maybe they came from Prague, maybe not, but so they were very prominent, and they were not particularly accepting of her. But eventually, she won them over with her warmth, and life was more or less kind of quote unquote normal. But my grandfather at one point said, "Let's go see this parade of these Nazis and see what these scoundrels are up to." And she remembers being on his shoulder and going to see this parade. But of course, not long after, we've skipped already to the slide of the Kristallnacht. It's okay, it's fine. She just remembers her father warning her that don't draw attention to yourself when you're walking the streets, and this was still the mid-30s, and just the brown shirts, don't draw attention to yourself, be invisible. This is a lesson my mother, I think, took with her for the rest of her life, to try to be invisible, and it was very hard for her. So she was taken out of the regular public school and put into a Jewish school as part of the segregation of the Jews. You can turn to the next slide. We can go to Kristallnacht. My mother did not like the word Kristallnacht. Crystal is something, she said, that's very beautiful. Her mother had crystal along in their apartment, and it was a beautiful item. So she called it the night of broken glass. And she was walking to school because her school at the time was in their synagogue on Fasanstrasse. And she remembers seeing this sort of scene with the glass completely broken. She remembers the red paint that was on the glass with the Jewish star or slogans, Nazi slogans, and the red paint was still somewhat dripping, looking like blood. So she had obviously an understanding that something terrible had happened. Her father had not been arrested, I don't know why, but she was walking, and a classmate came and said our synagogue is burning, and the firemen are doing nothing. So she started crying out to all the passersby, our synagogue is burning. And they ignored her. They walked by, they were embarrassed, they just kept walking. And so this was the Rosenstrasse Schule prior, and this is after. And her memoir actually was translated by Yad Vashem. And there's a photograph in there of the Rosenstrasse Schule actually burning on fire. And it's the first time I've seen that image. It was unnerving. So she was, at this point, already extremely well aware. They had been wearing Jewish stars already, she and her father. Her younger brother was a little too young to be wearing. I think he wore the star, but I'm not sure that he really went out that much at this point. She was wearing the star, and her schooling was, of course, disrupted. And you can go to the next slide, please. So is in 1939, this identity card was issued to her. Now, this identity card I've never actually seen in 3 dimensions, because my mother did not keep her cards. She did not keep her documents. So I had reached out to the Landesarchiv. There's so many research places now in Germany. I said, can you please, actually this was for her Wiedergutmach, and I said, can you please provide me all the backup documentation that my grandfather submitted for her Wiedergutmach and her reparations. I didn't know what to expect. So actually after her death, I had requested this back in March of a year ago or so, and I didn't see the email back. And after her death, I was going through my emails searching, and I said, what was the address she was living in? I couldn't remember. For some reason, I was drawing a blank. This was a couple of weeks after she had passed. And all of a sudden, their documents that they had provided me popped up in my inbox. I said, oh my gosh, I can't believe I missed this. And here's her identity card. And I will say that when I looked at this, I just see my daughter, who wears long braids. And it was somehow also made the entire situation so much more immediate and real. Not that I didn't know that my mother wore the star, not that I didn't know that my mother had Saba added to her name, not that I didn't know she was a survivor, but seeing this was incredibly poignant and emotional, and seeing her there, just like my daughter, it was very powerful. So the story is when they had to add Saba to their middle name, my mother was so terribly upset that why do I have to put a name in my name that's not mine? And he said, do you know what Saba means in Hebrew? And she said, no, it means princess, and you should never forget you are a princess. So I asked to just go back in time for a moment. There was one story about my grandmother when she was sewing on the yellow star to my mother's clothing, and my mother was, again, distraught, upset, afraid. And she said, I hate them. I hate them. And my grandmother, my Oma, said, Nein, don't hate them. Hate the evil. Now, I think that's a very deep and very profound level to be at that point. I don't think I would have had the same kind of response, because, but it was, my mother carried that with her the rest of her life. She tried very hard not to hate the Germans, and she herself was German, and her culture was, in a sense, stolen from her, and her language, in a sense, was dirtied by the, over the years. She didn't want to speak German, and there was a loss more of her culture that had somehow become vilified, and that she was proud of. She was proud of Goethe and Schiller, and and Beethoven. She was an incredibly proud cultural German, as well as embracing her Jewish identity. So this was a very powerful moment when I saw that. And included in it also, in the next slide, is when she was at the age of 14, they became eligible to be forced labor. So she turned 14 in November 1941. I guess it took them a little time to station her. So this was in the same email from the Landesarchiv. Of actually, I knew that she had been working in the munitions factory. I can't wait to hear your story, family story. So many parallels. And so here on the date, you would see that she was assigned labor at the munitions factory in 1942. And then again, it ended on the day she was arrested, which was February 27th, 1943. It was 8 a.m. and she had just arrived at the factory. She was Saturday. I think they must have, I don't remember asking her, but I think they worked 7 days a week, 11 hours a day. And she was at her station, and all of a sudden the factory was filled with SS men, Juden raus, and everyone, all the Jews who were there, got up to stand. She stood up, and she remembers seeing the foreman of this munitions factory shaking his head and looking at her and looking at the Jewish workers. And she knew right at that moment that he was sympathetic to their plight, but he was powerless to do anything. I think he was asleep. And at this time, they were then loaded into trucks, and she was panicked and she was crying. They're gonna gas us. She felt an incredibly ominous feeling, and the woman said, "Nein, function, it's okay." Luckily, they were not gassed. They were taken to the Pooh dance hall, where she had to present her identity card and whatnot, and she was told to be detained. So she was there until late at night, and her name was called again, and she came down, and the assessment said, "You can go." And she was standing there in shock. And so she left. It was the middle of the night. She was on the street, and there was one other person who apparently had also been let go. And they just looked at each other, and she must have caught a bus. And she went home and knocked at the door, and her father answered the door and nearly collapsed when he saw her, just of utmost relief. So then they were not called back to labor, and on March, sorry, I'm not used to using a microphone. On March 5th, her mother, who normally went to pick up the ration cards at a school, went to pick them up and came back and told them, me, my opa, and my mother and my brother, my mother's brother, that they would not give her the ration cards, that they have to go themselves to pick them up. And my opa said, "That's it, put on extra layers of clothes." And they did. And they went with my grandmother to the school where the ration cards were, and immediately were arrested and separated from my grandmother. And while they were still in the same room, they had not been separated yet by gender. While they were still in this room, they heard a woman crying out, "You cannot take my children from me." We can change slides. One more slide. This is the final roundup on February 27th. It's just a map of where the Rosenstrasse was in the middle of the map. Next slide, please. Oh, one more. So there was a voice, "You cannot take my children from me. Let me go with my children." And her father turned to her and her brother and says, "Das ist unsere Mutti." This is our mother. And And my mother could not even recognize her voice. It was so distorted. I cannot even imagine. So they were there for a few hours and eventually then relocated to Rosenstrasse. And you can go to the next slide, please. So at Rosenstrasse, my mother and her father and brother were separated. They separated the men and the women. And my mother was put into a room. There were a few other women in this room with very thin mattresses and a bucket. And a couple of the women in the room were completely despondent and non-responsive. And one woman started speaking to my mother and told her, you know what has been happening here this week? I must tell you. And she commenced to tell her the story of Rosenstrasse, how every day that she had been there since February 27th, the women are protesting. The women are calling for us, for their husbands to be released. Every day I hear more voices. And every day it seems to get louder. And at one point, an SS man came in and he said, and I don't know the German because my German is limited, although somehow I understood my mother. And when I didn't, I would just say something in German that I thought sounded German and it would give her a great laugh. But an SS man entered at one point and said, do you hear these women out here? Do you hear them begging for their husbands to be given back? Das ist deutsche Treue. That's German loyalty. So my mother was there, detained. Her memories were somewhat, I'm trying to piece back some of her memories in my own research, hence these documents that I find. But she was there, they got no food or drink. And the next morning, she was called back down into the big hall and was told she could go home. Again, completely bewildered, perplexed. And she and her brother were sent home that day. Can you please change the slide? March 6th. This was also in the documentation that I received as substantiation for her Wiedergutmachung. What's interesting, I don't see the Nazi stamp on here, but it's quite obviously dated 1946, 1943. It also has Rita Sava Kuhn. And this number, the 61214, is the same number I find on her school cards, etc. So there is a consistency. Strange that there was no stamp. So she was released. And I think the next day, her father was released. And then they were reassigned to forced labor on the railroad where she was for the remainder of the war. And eventually they were liberated by the Soviet army, of which she has incredible memories. But I don't need to go into that at this time. I don't know what the next slide is. It's probably of the Soviet army dancing. She remembers hearing the balalaika and etc. She also remembers some very scary moments. But there was one soldier who protected her. She was a very lovely, lovely young woman and was thankfully spared some of the worst of the treatment of these soldiers who were really quite bitter and angry. Please change the slide. And they actually, when they came to meet the soldiers at the barracks, they did not believe that they were actually Jewish, even though they had the papers and their yellow stars. They said, no, that's not possible. There are no Jews left in Germany. And they begged and they said, no, I don't believe it. Actually, say the Shema. And the Shema is a prayer we say 3 times a day. And it is a declaration of monotheism and of it would be the last prayer if you could say it on before you die, which I said for my mother. This was what they said. This is what eventually allowed them to be protected by the Soviet army. And they eventually had a sign, because after a lot of harassment, the soldiers coming drunk, looking for Frauen, and my mother having to put yucky makeup on, looking at babushka on her head, etc., so the men would not harass her. They finally got a sign up on their door saying, these are Jews, they have been persecuted enough, please leave them alone. And this soldier, Sasha, helped get this sign on their door. If you could please change the slide. And so in 1946, she was given this card. And I think that is pretty much it. There's one more picture of my mother. If you could, this is my mutti. One of my favorite pictures of her. So my mother spent many, many years, 30 years or so, speaking to children in schools about the importance of speaking up against injustice, against bullying, and it was her mission in life to carry these women's message forward. I just want to say one last thing, which is yesterday we just celebrated the holiday of Purim, which is actually centered around a female heroine, Esther, who saved her people from mass destruction. And I find it incredibly appropriate that we're celebrating this today, not just because of the International Women's Day, but because of Purim. And actually, my daughter, who is taking a gap year in Israel, has celebrated Shushan Purim today in Jerusalem, which is the day when people who live in the walled cities in Israel celebrate Purim. So I want to thank you all for listening. Thank you for being here, and turn it over to you.
Thank you.
So, oops. Thank you so much.
True. This is, we never met before, but it was like a deja vu. It's incredible because I have many of those documents from my mother. The ID card with the J, the Sarah, the ration cards, and then after liberation, the same part and the same story. She wrote a book about it called "The Song Is Over." Same story. May 8th, 1945, Russian soldiers come, and she said Shema Israel because they don't believe there are any Jews left. So I'm sorry they never met, but I just had to say that. I'm very moved, and we are now hearing from the expert who wrote this history, the history of the Rosenstrasse. Nathan Stoltzfus, who will bring us to the historical context of these personal stories.
Yes, thank you very much. I was so delighted to meet your mother back when she was teaching at Berkeley, and I'm so thankful that I met her. Also, that she was not rounded up after released from the Rosenstrasse and sent and deported. In fact, I know there's no shred of evidence that the Jews from the Rosenstrasse, and we have another descendant right here whose relative was also in the Rosenstrasse and not rounded up in the days following Rosenstrasse. But we gather to honor these women and their protest, and they lifted their voice in protest in this murderously cold weather against this murderous regime, against Hitler's efforts to complete its annihilation of German Jews, amidst a massive arrest action, which the architect of the Holocaust, Heinrich Himmler, called the Entjudung des Reichsgebietes, that is, the elimination of every Jew from German soil. Now, even the Mischlinge, or half-Jews, were removed from concentration camps according to this order. And at the same time, Joseph Goebbels resolved on February the 18th, 1943, to dispatch every person in Berlin wearing the yellow star. That is, he wanted to present Hitler a birthday present on April the 20th with a city free of Jews, the Reich capital. And in fact, on December the 6th, 1942, Hitler had commissioned Goebbels to deport all Jews who were not privileged. That's in his diary. And this included, of course, the Jews in non-privileged intermarriages. The Jews in intermarriages who were not privileged were the star. It's so important. A lot of people think that all intermarried Jews were privileged, but no, Hitler divided them up just like he divided the Mischling in order to deal with them bit and piecemeal, trying to see how it went within the Reich. Of course, outside of the Reich in the Eastern territories, if you didn't divorce, you were deported along with your Jewish partner because Hitler's image didn't matter there. Hitler wasn't trying to change them into something. Well, in the midst of this incredible suffering, as more than 7,000 Berlin Jews arrested along with the husbands of these women were sent to their death. But of course, the protest effort by these women was entirely superfluous. The regime had no intention of harming a single intermarried Jew. We know this from a Gestapo document or two. So we have to admit that these women were courageous, but we have to admit this only because they did not know better. They did not know that the Gestapo shared their goal. The Gestapo too was intent on uniting them at home as families. Jews and non-Jews together, committing racial treason, Rassenschande. The women were courageous because, as one historian wrote, they did not know they were walking through an open door. Courageous because they were naive. That's the cost for them of having courage. From a range of eyewitnesses, we know that this massive arrest was extraordinarily brutal. Even the SS newspaper, Schwarze Chor, wrote in astonishment about the public brutality, not the brutality, about the publicness of the brutality. But Goebbels had planned this public brutality to intimidate any pushback. A Gestapo document 2 days before the protest started actually anticipated what they called Ausschreitung, maybe riots. They didn't want to draw attention to these mixed marriage people, that they still existed. Goebbels brought in the most elite group of SS to lead the arrests in Berlin. A whole range of witnesses attest to the presence of the SS Leibstandarte. Eyewitnesses include Hildegard Henschel, wife of Jewish leader Moritz Henschel. Jews during this operation were kicked, beaten, she wrote, bones were broken, blood streamed across faces as doors of the trucks were opened and they tumbled out into the Sammellager. This open brutality happened as the protest was getting underway. So the women were courageous, but we know they could have spared themselves the effort. We know as well that these protesting women faced death. From a whole range of witnesses, we know that armed guards threatened to shoot them down in the streets. Repeatedly, they shouted, "Clear the streets or we'll shoot." And they made other intimidating threats and the sound of gunshots. But we know the Gestapo was not going to do that. No intermarried Jew was to be harmed, let alone their Aryan family members. After all, according to interpretations of Gestapo documents, the Jews were held at Rosenstrasse only for two purposes. First, to register them. They were the most registered people in the world. Second, to select some for jobs. 10% were assigned new job promotions. For these purposes, they were squashed into rooms so small they had to take turns lying down. And this went on for a week. It went on as loud protests continued outside, so loud, Goebbels called them very unpleasant, unfortunate circumstances, a very big problem in order just to register Jews in a way that had never been done before and was never done since. We know the women agreed already on the first day of the arrest to gather and make a scene. Charlotte Israel told me that. Already early the next day, as one woman near Rosenstrasse in Radlauer, she heard the bitter demands of these women louder and louder as she came closer and closer. "Give us our husbands back." But it was all unnecessary, all a wasted effort. The Gestapo, in fact, went out of its way to reunite children with their parents imprisoned at Rosenstrasse so that they could be cared for. We have the Gestapo, not the protesting women to thank for the rescue of these Jews, so we are told. This is the main line of prominent historians and prominent institutions guarding public memory today. But wait, does that sound right to you? Does this sound like the Gestapo we know? Does this sound like Hitler bent on a historic mission to annihilate all Jews? I didn't think so. Additionally sobering is the way that Jewish eyewitness reports that contradict this interpretation that the Jews were not in danger are simply kicked to the streets as unreliable. In order to sustain this interpretation, we have to say they are false, they're misguided, they didn't know what they were talking about. Is it worth it? Bruno Blau, a Jewish historian, a statistician, and a lawyer, wrote that 11,000 Jews in Intermarriage survived the war, and he was right there and knew, right on top of it. Of course, these were numbers from November, but the people deported after that generally survived Theresias died. In fact, the Gestapo had a practice that they deported intermarried Jews when their non-Jewish partner divorced and not before. In May of 1943, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the main security office, issued a order that all Jews now on German soil would be sent to Auschwitz, except intermarried Jews. They were not to be sent. In fact, that order goes on to say that any Jews intermarried who were sent to Auschwitz or Theresienstadt on false charges, and just 400, more than 400 alone, had been accused of crimes and sent to Auschwitz on false trumped up charges. And this memo said if they were sent on trumped up charges, they were to be returned. In any case, I suggest that we honor these women by honoring their word. They were not in position to know Gestapo machinations, but we have no reason not to believe the images and the composite image of their description of the protest, of the huge crowds, the street black with people, of calling out together in a protest again and again loudly, not silent, loud. That's what makes it a good example of civil courage, that they spoke up, that they did it openly. This is the problem, as Susan said, that it's not supposed to be possible. And of course, these were special circumstances. No one is waving a finger to accuse everybody in a moral way of not having done more. We're just trying to understand what happened. We need to know. We have no reason not to believe their images, their description of the huge crowds calling out together, of the SS brutality, of the danger they faced, of the various threats to intimidate them, of the fact that they were willing to die right there on the spot. One of the reasons they were willing, in fact, because they wanted to let their Jewish folks know that they had not abandoned them. If all the rest had forsaken them, as it appeared, they would not. They would not. This was another day of loyalty for these women. If there is any reports we should trust, it is these women, not the Gestapo. After all, these women proved their loyalty day after day, year after year, under extreme pressures to divorce. They built resistance into their lives. They modeled what Václav Havel called the attempt to live in the truth. The attempt to live in the truth involved a lot of compromise. They have earned our trust above others. On the other hand, Gestapo documents are laced with deceptions and euphemisms. It is very easy to be mistaken, always possible, always important to say. But I submit we can trust these women's testimonies. In addition to these protesters' testimonies, this current dominant narrative disregards like detritus the testimonies of Jews who knew the protest was the agency that rescued the Rosenstrasse persons from the Holocaust. The proponents of the narrative that these women were courageous but ineffective disregard one eyewitness after another. Take, for example, Martha Mosse. Martha Mosse was the head of housing for years, and she said, as plain as you can say, that these women were going, this was a missionary action, and they were going to be deported, and then they were not because of the intervention of their partners. Martha Wilson. She would have known. There's no reason to disbelieve her. Siegfried Kleiman, the director of personnel at the Jewish community, who would have known, had to know, said these persons were supposed to be put on a train and then no one would have heard from them again. Why would they not have been? These were the most loathsome Jews in the Third Reich, committing continuous Rassenschande and bearing children, Mischlinge, that caused all kinds of strife among people who wanted to see the black and white of the Nazi. Others as well testified of the intention of the Gestapo to deport these Rosenstrasse Jews. One of the most magnificent and selfless resistors was Gertrude Luckner. Read about her if you can. An amazing woman who had no reason to involve herself, but went around finding out what the Gestapo planned just so she could warn Jews. And she was arrested in late February 1943 precisely because she was so well informed about what was going to happen that she went around alerting intermarried Jews about the danger that they were in of being deported. She was so well informed that she told them they should not in any way disobey the laws, because this was one of the conditions on which intermarried Jews were being deported, not in the general deportations, but on the trumped up charges. So she's a magnificent source. Margareta Sommer, help of Bishop Preising in August 1943, wrote that protests led to the release of intermarried Jews in March 1943, black and white. Gerhard Leifeld wrote in March 1943, connecting protests and the release of the Jews. U.S. intelligence itself, in March 1943, used the same word that Goebbels did in his diary, that because of protest, the action had to be discontinued. So let's honor these women by honoring their word. Let's honor them by upholding human rights as they did. Let's honor them by fighting anti-Semitism as they did.